everybody, Deathblade here. Sorry, it's been a while since I put a video up. It's been Spring Festival, Chinese New Year here in China. I've been super busy and super tired and all kinds of stuff. Today we're going to be talking about clothing in Chinese fantasy novels and what you might expect to see, what you might expect to not see, and everything in between. This is a really big subject. I did actually a lot of research on it, and I pulled up a lot of pictures. So most of this video is actually going to be pictures, not me as a talking head. I think that it's a topic that you could write entire books on. So this is only going to be a very brief overview. We're mostly going to talk about historical and historically accurate clothing. Then we're going to talk about the Daoist robes, because a lot of you are fans of Xianxia novels, and in Xianxia novels there are a lot of Daoist robes. So we're going to go into those two different topics. All right, let's get started. So I'm pulling up here. I'm going to scroll through this image as I talk. Basically, these images are of women's clothing. It's harder to find stuff like this for men's clothing, but I'm showing this to you to illustrate how much Chinese clothing changed throughout the years, from time period to time period, from dynasty to dynasty. The thing is that in the thousands of years that make up Chinese history, there were all different types of clothing, as you can see in some of these pictures. In fact, every single time that a new dynasty was founded, they would almost always make new rules about the clothing in terms of what the different people who were part of the court would wear, what people should wear for ceremonies, what the court officials should wear, what the military should wear, what people in different social statuses should wear. Sometimes the new clothing rules, the dress code, I guess you could say, would basically sort of like codify what had become popular toward the end of the previous dynasty. Sometimes they would go back to ancient styles of clothing and bring them back. Other times they would just make up new dress codes. So it really changed from time period to time period. Also, all these different styles of clothing from dynasty to dynasty, from generation to generation, things that were typical of the clothing styles would change. So the sleeve length, the sleeve width, how long the skirts were, the style of the skirts, the collars, the fastenings, the belt, everything would be different from one period to the next. Some periods, for example, they would wear breeches that would go down to the knee. Other times they would wear trousers that would go much further down. So really it's impossible to answer the question of what would they be wearing, especially if you're talking about a fantasy novel where the author presumably could sort of draw inspiration from history, but wouldn't necessarily give a specific time period. In their mind, it's really hard to say what a specific, country or group within the novel is going to be dressed like, unless they specifically say so. If you're reading a wuxia novel, then obviously you could look up some information about the specific dynasty that the novel takes place in, if you know, which you don't always know. One thing that actually remained a constant through much of Chinese history, which is also something that, if you know about, can make you somewhat of an expert on the way that the clothing should be portrayed, especially in wuxia novels that are supposed to be historical, and even in the more magical fantasy genres like wuxia and xinhuan. Usually they're going to be based on Chinese history, and so therefore the clothing should emulate as much as possible. And you would think that the authors would most likely want the clothing to emulate historical reality. And one of the things that was almost always the case was that the garment would fasten from the left down to the right, and it would fold over left to right. So in other words, the right part of the robe would be folded over the body, then the left side, so left over right. This went through pretty much all of Chinese history. It was actually a way that it was one of the ways that they used to describe the difference between China and, civilized people, so to speak, and the barbarians. There was even a phrase at one point where barbarians were described as having unbound hair and robe on the left, which was referring to how they folded it. We'll talk about the hair in a second. But the point is that almost without fail, the garments went from the top of the left shoulder down to the right. Now, I actually searched for longer than I should have, trying to find some examples of situations where this was wrong. This is one picture right here. You can see the guy's garment actually goes the opposite direction. Instead of going from his left shoulder down to the right hip, folding over, it goes the opposite way. So that's not how it would have been historically. I tried to find more images like this, and to be honest, most of the images that I found were actually the correct way, whether they were from Chinese movies, Western movies, TV shows. And again, I didn't spend a huge amount of time searching for the wrong way to do it, but I was hoping to find some good examples. Here are some examples of the correct way, this is from the web novels written by Tina Lynch, who's an author on Wuxia World. She writes original Chinese fantasy genre novels, and as you can see in these images, the character has the garment correctly draping from the top left to the right over the other side. And I actually asked her about it. She wasn't even aware of that, that was how it was supposed to be, but she had asked her artist to do some research to make sure the images were authentic, and this was the result, and pretty authentic. I think most costume designers, whether they're from China or from overseas, and artists as well, if they're going to be doing costumes, they are going to do some research. And this information about the fold of the garment is not really, a big secret. You can even find the information in English, let alone in Chinese. So I think most people who are going to be depicting clothing would be able to find that out. Now, ironically, later I went to the official art page for I Shall Seal the Heavens, where I've gathered some of the, officially released art for the novel, to pull some images, and to my shock, I actually found almost one of the first images on the page. It's the opposite. The garment folds from right over left, which is not how it would have been historically in China for the most part. And at first I thought, maybe the drawing was done and then flipped around or something. But going down through the images, if you go to the I Shall Seal the Heavens art page, you'll find there are actually quite a few characters who have the garment folded over incorrectly, at least according to how it would have been in Chinese history. So, this is the kind of thing I'm not going to ask the author about unless it comes up in conversation one day. I really doubt it was an intentional decision on his part. I just really, of all the things, the images for the I Shall Seal the Heavens characters are not super accurate anyway, according to how they're described in the story. So I really doubt that he was like, oh, by the way, make sure to fold their garments incorrectly. I really doubt that. Probably, maybe the artist flipped the image before providing the final image, or perhaps the artist just didn't know. I guess that's possible. I'm surprised that a Chinese artist drawing Chinese characters in China, who's adept at drawing these kind of fantasy images, would make that kind of blunder, but I guess that's what happened. So going into TV shows and movies, this is a great place to go to get a general idea of what the costumes look like. Here's a couple images. As you can see, all of the garments are folded correctly or draped correctly, however you want to say it. And you're going to see all kinds of different mixes of the different types of garments, from military to court to different social classes, different time periods. The thing is, whenever you're dealing with television shows and movies, obviously there's going to be costume designers, and it's going to be hard to figure out whether those costumes are historically accurate or not. And again, if it's a fantasy setting, like really high level fantasy with magic and stuff, then it doesn't matter as much. But I would definitely recommend watching some movies and television shows to get a good feel. And if you're interested in the historical side, then that's going to be where you're going to need to do a little bit of research on your own. In addition to the way the garment folds, one other thing that's very important throughout Chinese history is the hair. So for the most part, through almost all of Chinese history, hair was worn long by both men and women, and it should have been bound on top of the head. I've gathered a few images of men with that kind of hair. Whether it was men or women, they would have their hair up. That was a proper and civilized thing to do. They would let it down at night and then bind it up again in the morning. And, this is reflected in the television shows and movies. Whenever you see people with their hair down, long and down, usually there's some reason for it. Maybe they've been fighting, maybe they're in mourning, maybe they're down and out. But for respectable people, the hair is always going to be long and then worn up in some sort of top knot or some other thing like that. Matters with hair actually segue nicely into the next section, where I'm going to talk about some other types of situations where there are deviations from the norm. One is going to be the Qing Dynasty style clothing and the hair. So here are two images, both of them depicting the same general kind of clothing, and one of them has a unique hairstyle. The one on the right is Jet Li, of course. He's a really famous actor who's in a lot of wuxia and kung fu movies, and also xianxia movies. So this sort of garment with a collar like this and just general look and feel tends to be the kind of clothing that they wore in the Qing dynasty, which is the very last dynasty before it came to the modern era, basically. And the people who were in charge of the Qing dynasty were not Chinese, and so a lot of the fashion during that time period changed. And another thing that was a big change was the hair. So for the most part, this hairstyle with the front shave, that is unique to the Qing dynasty, and that was a thing that the government used to control the people. As I mentioned before, having long hair and having it bound up was the cultural style throughout almost all of Chinese history, and that was the way civilized people did it. So when the men were forced to wear their hair like this, it was pretty much a big humiliation, especially at first. Although it came to be the norm, it was definitely a big deviation from Chinese culture. Another situation where you're going to see people dressed differently is with monks. So and with monks, the hair is different because they shave their entire head for different reasons. Now, especially early on in Chinese history, that was kind of a big, kind of crazy thing because everybody else had long hair. But monks are a big part of both the wuxia novels and even xianxia novels. They have no hair, they have long robes. They're actually relatively similar to the kind of Daoist robes that we're going to be talking about, but not exactly the same. So let's get into talking about the Daoist robes. So first of all, this is kind of a boring picture, but it shows you sort of like a black and white schematic. I don't know, what are these things called? I forget what it's called when you have the plan for how to make clothing. Pattern. The pattern, right. This is the pattern for a real life Daoist robe. And one of the first things you notice is it has really wide sleeves and obviously wide skirts, I guess you could say. Same folding pattern though, going from the top of the left down to the right over the other side of the garment. Here's an actual picture as opposed to the pattern. And, obviously the sleeves were very long. Not every single Daoist robe would necessarily be like this, but this is definitely typical of what you would expect. Here's an actual picture of someone in modern days dressed up in that same kind of thing. Whenever you read in the novels about people flicking or waving their sleeve, it makes more sense when you see a big sleeve like this, and you can imagine how cool that could be if you did it in the correct way. Now this next picture is a great one, I think. One of the things you find in the fantasy novels, whether it's wuxia, xianxia, or others, is a lot of times people in one sect or clan sometimes will wear different robes depending on their rank, whether it's their cultivation level or just simply their rank in the clan. I think this is a really good example to show how that could possibly happen. So many times people in one organization are going to have different clothes depending on their rank, and this is a really good example of a Daoist different sets of clothing that go more complicated, more fancy as the ranks get higher, but you could kind of see these all as being one group. If they all had the same exact robe color, it would be a little bit better, but you get the idea. You can see how the one on the left is going to be a student or maybe an outer sect member, and maybe the next one is some sort of elder, and then you have like a patriarch, and then you have the highest guy in the sect or whatever. Next, here is, you can see that they're not just designed for standing around. This is a variation on some kind of martial artist who's a Daoist, and even in movement, you can see how they would flow very well. One thing that's worth talking about is Taoist women. So, women are part of Taoism, and the thing is, historically speaking, they would probably have worn very similar clothing to the men. Here are two old-timey pictures. I can't verify how exactly old they are, but they're both depicting real-life Taoist women. And as you can see, it's very similar to what you would expect the men to wear. Next one, here's a martial artist who's a Daoist. And again, the clothing is good for movement, but in real life, it would be very close to the robes that the men would wear. And here's an actual modern day Daoist woman who is a leader of some kind of organization. Again, very similar to the men's clothing, and if you didn't know it was a woman, you might not be able to tell. Finally, here's another old-timey kind of picture, also supposedly depicting a famous woman from Taoist history. This one's a little bit more feminine and makes it more obvious that she's a woman. Before we move on to the next topic, which is talking about how the clothing is depicted in the novels, I'd like to point out that headgear is a really important topic. I'm going to show a few pictures here. These are not necessarily specifically related to Taoism, I don't think, not every single one of them. But as you can see, there are all different types of headgear. We've seen a few of them in the pictures I've shown already, but there are all different types, really depending on the rank, on the function, on who that person is. Really hard to say from the novel unless it specifically says, which I think a lot of times the authors aren't really thinking of those things as being important. Okay, so moving on, we can talk a little bit about how the clothing is portrayed in media. Here is a costume. Obviously, this looks quite different from the real historical and functional Taoist robes that we've seen. But this is the kind of stuff you expect to see on the characters when they're in television shows. And here's an artist depiction. It's very similar. You again see the way that the robe is folded from left over to the right. Something that comes in a lot in the fantasy stories is some kind of waist girdle or belt, something at the waist that's almost armor-like. You see that in a lot of the pictures. They often wear long boots. One thing that tends to come into the picture is armor. Here's one of the characters from I Shall Seal the Heavens, and as you can see, there's a lot of armor-like aspects to this character's costume, which is still supposed to be a Taoist robe, supposedly. In the Xianxia stories, almost everything tends to be referred to as a Taoist robe a lot of times, at least in the novels that I translate. Obviously, the sects within the novels are not literally practicing Taoism, and they're not literal Taoists per se, but it's built on that foundation and with that inspiration. Other times, the depictions will be a lot more realistic, like this one. As you can, if you notice, there's like little pendants hanging from the guy's belt and things like that. All of those parts of clothing were, different from dynasty to dynasty, and the rules and regulations were different. So a lot of these things are just pulled from a variety of historical references. Here's another one where it's more armor-like. You can see the hair bound up at the top of the fancy headgear. Now let's move on to women. A lot of times the way that the women are portrayed, I think that this one here is probably a lot more realistic in terms of what it would look like if the universe was based on something more akin to historical China in terms of ancient China. Here's another one which is starting to get more fantastic. I think it's a lot more realistic. One of the main reasons being the modesty of how the woman is dressed, because frankly speaking, throughout Chinese history, most of the time modesty was pretty important. I mean, usually showing skin and things like that was definitely not appropriate, and especially not for Taoist women. Again, the characters are not actual Taoists, but here's another one where, as you can kind of see, this is starting to get more what people, and especially guys, I think, would expect and like the characters that are female to dress like, more low cut, more sexy. And then you get into stuff like this, which is, I mean, you see this all the time, mostly in drawings and in maybe animated stuff or like comic book type stuff. I don't see the characters dressing like this in the TV shows. That's not even really allowed in China. I guess if the TV show were being made outside of China where there wasn't a lot of censorship, it might be possible. But there was even a recent TV show, not Xianxia related. It was actually more of a historical drama where the women were dressed like they dressed. I think it was in the Tang Dynasty. I'm sorry, I should have done my research ahead of time about this aspect, but they wore relatively low cut garments, and it didn't fly in China, and they had to re-edit a lot of scenes to cut out the low cut dresses. And here's another one where it's like, I mean, I don't care how immodest of a time period it was in China. I really doubt that women in any sort of organization would dress like this, but it sure looks cool, right? So, okay, this video went on for a long time. I hope it was helpful. The answer to the question of what would the clothing look like and what would the Taoist clothing look like is really impossible to answer unless, again, you're talking about a historically accurate piece. It's going to depend on the author's vision, or if the author doesn't really have a vision, the vision of whoever is the art director on whatever it is that you're watching, whether it's a game, TV show, movie, or whatever. I suggest, if you haven't already, take the time to watch some movies, watch some drama shows so that you can get an idea of what the clothing would look like. And, if you have a minute, go to Google or whatever search engine you like to use and type in historical Chinese clothing, Taoist clothing, martial artists, Xianxia, Wuxia. You can get a lot of good ideas. I also have a Pinterest page, I'll link to it, where I have collected a whole bunch of images, all specifically relating to Wuxia and Xianxia, costumes, monsters, landscapes. It's a really great place to get inspiration on the look and the feel of these type of worlds. Okay, if you have any suggestions for videos you'd like to see, please leave them in the comments, and I'll see you on the next video.